Welcome, everybody. Thank you for attending our Fall 2020 Friday Forum series. The theme of our series is the state of our democracy. So we kind of wanted to zoom out during an election year and think about the forces that shape our democracy, how people participate both in and outside the polls. So this series is made possible by our generous sponsors, which includes the McKinley Foundation, the Center for Advanced Studies, Women and Gender in Global Perspectives Program, the Department of Religion, Department of Journalism, the Humanities Research Institute, Education Policy Organization and Leadership, EPOL, and the Social Action Committee of the Unitarian Universalist Church, Urbana Champaign Friends Meeting, and Channing Murray. Thank you all to thank you to our sponsors. Thank you to the Friday Forum Committee, Kathleen Robbins, Jorge Mina, Nancy Dietrich, Claire Soak. I'm really appreciative of your time in putting together this series. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Griselda. And yeah, thanks, Griselda.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Griselda, and I'm one of the Vistas with the New American Welcome Center. We just wanted to start off by kind of giving a little brief note about Welcoming Week and what that is for anybody who may not know. Welcoming Week is a global celebration that welcomes immigrants and refugees by celebrating diversity, promoting inclusivity, and fostering connection in the community. This year, Welcoming Week has been taking part from September 12th up to the 20th. So we're super excited that this Friday Forum is in partnership with Welcoming Week. And throughout this week, we've been able to bring over 30 events celebrating this year's theme, which is creating home together. So if you have some time left in your week, definitely check out any of the rest of the events that are going on. More information on them could be found at our website, which is universityymca.org/welcome. And additionally to that, we also wanted to quickly make a note that if you yourself, or if you know anyone who hasn't filled out the census yet, to please make sure to do that. To be counted, you have to fill out your census by the 30th of September. So that deadline is coming up. The census is incredibly important because it helps us bring resources to our community. It helps determine funding for a community for services like schools, hospitals, food stamps, and things of that nature. And additionally to that, the census also helps determine the political representation that each state gets. So it's incredibly important that every single person is counted on the census to make sure Illinois is represented properly and appropriately. So please make sure you do that. And if you have any questions or any concerns, please feel free to reach out to the American Welcome Center, and we'd be happy to help in any way we can. And lastly, I also wanted to say that if anybody is interested in donating to the New American Welcome Center's Immigrant Relief Fund, you can find more information about that on our website as well. The Immigrant Relief Fund helps provide emergency financial assistance to families who need it. We've been able to assist over 860 individuals and over 220 households for areas like rent assistance, food, and utilities, so very important needs. So if anybody is interested in donating, or if you yourself need some form of resources or help, again, please feel free to contact us and let us know, and donate anything you can on our website. So having said that, I am happy to introduce our panelists for today. One of our speakers is Nancy Flores, originally from Los Angeles, California. Nancy has always had a deep connection to the struggles of immigrants and low-wage workers. Growing up, her parents, who are now naturalized citizens from Mexico, embodied this intersection. Nancy comes to the National Partnership for New Americans from Voces de la Frontera, which is Wisconsin's leading immigrant rights group and a member organization of NPNA. Nancy's track record includes, but is not limited to, successfully organizing and advocating for hundreds of families facing deportation, established multiple programs, including leadership pipelines for youth and immigrant women, led statewide policy campaigns and national campaigns, as well as fundraising efforts. Additionally to Nancy, she is joined by two of her colleagues. One of them is Abdel Nasser Rashid. 53 years ago, Abdel Nasser's parents moved to America from a rural Palestinian village where education opportunities were scarce, especially for women. They were among the first in their village to send their daughters to college. Abdel Nasser grew up helping his mother run a booth at the local flea market, and his father operated a small retail business in Chicago. He went on to earn his degree from Harvard, and Abdel Nasser has experience in government, campaigns, and civic engagement as well. He worked for the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights from 2012 to 2014. And inspired by his parents' story, Abdel Nasser has helped research where new citizens can be most impactful and create the data-driven strategy for new American voters in the 2020 campaign. And additionally, Diego Inez Lopez, he is the Policy and Campaigns Manager for the National Partnership for New Americans. Diego has experience in immigration law, including helping immigrants apply for asylum, special immigrant juvenile status, deferred action for childhood arrivals, and temporary protected status, as well as policy and advocacy. Before joining MPNA, Diego worked for the Dili Pro Bono Project, formerly called the Cara Family Detention Pro Bono Project, and the Opportunity Agenda. He received his JD from Rutgers College of Law, Newark, and BA from University of Maryland College Park. Diego was born and raised in New York City and is the son of Cuban and Chilean immigrants who are both naturalized. So thank you guys for being here, and I will go ahead and pass it on to you now.
Thank you, and thank you to the YMCA New American Welcome Center for this invitation. The YMCA New American Welcome Center is one of 52 campaign partners of the New American Voters 2020 campaign, which we'll get into in the meat of our presentation and talk a little bit about that. Before we get into the conversation, I wanted to spend a little time to tell you a little bit about who the National Partnership for New Americans is. So who we are, my colleagues and I, and so the National Partnership for New Americans is a national network comprised of 41 immigrant and refugee advocacy organizations that do a wider range of services, from deportation defense to legal services, to citizenship, to healthcare and upward mobility work. So we're a really diverse network, and I want to tell a little bit about the story of how we became a network. So around the time that Obama was elected, our network had come together, the 9 leading organizations within the network. So this is before we were formalized as a network. And the 9 organizations said, all right, we're about to get immigration reform. It's right around the corner. And our network of immigrant rights organizations is not prepared to be able to process a mass legalization. So that's how the National Partnership for New Americans came to be. It was out of this need that we needed to have a network that really only focused on the full integration of immigrants. So what happens after you get that green card in your hand? It's a process, right? All of the problems in the world don't go away when somebody legalizes. There's different obstacles such as English. Obviously, discrimination oftentimes doesn't see if we have legal status or not, right? So that's how we came to be. So our network has obviously grown from the 9 small but mighty organizations to now 41 organizations across 37 states. So our focus is really around immigrant integration or full immigrant inclusion. So obviously, I don't have to tell you the spoiler there. We did not get immigration reform under the Obama administration. On the contrary, I think we all know the obstacles faced by immigrants during that administration. And thankfully, we were able to get DACA, but we know that has been something we've had to fight really hard to keep. So that's a little bit about NPNA and how we came to be and what we're focused on. So fast forward a few years, in the absence of immigration reform, we focused really heavily on naturalization and citizenship. And my colleague Diego is going to get into a little bit of that trajectory and what we were able to accomplish in expanding access to naturalization. So today we're going to talk a little bit about, Abdel Nasser is going to kick us off shortly on just some of the research tied to voting, and particularly minorities, and what are some of the trends that we've seen. And especially thinking about this critical year, I don't know about you, but I know that in 2019, as many of us were for many people, 2019 was kind of a prep year for 2020. And then 2020 was like, hey, we have completely different plans for you guys. So we've had to kind of spend the first part of the year figuring out, right, what these plans look like. So we're excited to share what we've learned through running a digital campaign focused on getting immigrant voters out, right? Despite all of the challenges, we know that there's still a huge desire for folks to vote this fall. And so for the purposes of our conversation, we're going to be using two terms pretty interchangeably. Immigrant voters, we're going to be using pretty interchangeably with the term new American voters. So an immigrant voter is somebody that was not born in the United States, but then was able to naturalize. And because they've become, naturalization is the process to become a citizen, right? So now that they've become a citizen, they're eligible to vote. So that's what we mean by an immigrant voter. And it's synonymous for the purposes of this conversation when we also say new American voter. Depending on who you read, some people think that the term new American is actually a little bit more broad, and that would encompass me and my colleagues who are born US citizens, but have immigrant parents. But like I said, for the purposes of today's conversation, those two terms are synonymous. And then lastly, I want to just close out this introduction to our work by acknowledging and honoring the Black activists and those who are still with us and those who've passed, but that have done really some of the most challenging work around securing the right to voting. And we acknowledge through this campaign that we stand on the shoulders of giants. This is work that we're able to do as non-Black people of color because Black folks have paved the way for us. So that's something that we hold really present in all of the work that we do, and just want to make that acknowledgement. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague Abdel Nasser Rashid, who's gonna kick off today's presentation. Abdel Nasser?
Thank you, Nancy, and thank you all so much for organizing this important conversation. Having worked in the immigrant rights movement and understanding the power of immigrant voters and the way that we've been talking about it for the last 10, 15 years, I think we've all seen the headlines about immigrant voters, about Latinos and Asians and others. And it was really exciting earlier this year to be asked to join this project to really look at new citizens in particular, where they are living and where they can have the greatest electoral impact. And one of the really fascinating and powerful trends is that over 5 million people have naturalized since Donald Trump announced his candidacy for president. So more than 5 million newly naturalized in basically the last 6 years. And that's looking at what states they live in, what counties and districts they live in, can give us a lot of information about where they can have the greatest impact on elections. And part of the backdrop for this is that naturalized citizens have a lower likelihood to vote than someone who's born in the US. This is based on Pew Research. So while in 2016, 73% of US born, native born registered voters cast the ballot, only about 64% of naturalized citizens who are registered to vote cast the ballot. The good news is that gap, that roughly 10-point gap, has been decreasing, but it has been a gap nonetheless. And so currently about 10 points. And the goal is to make sure that we reduce that gap, right, and close that gap so that naturalized citizens are voting like the rest of the electorate and are able to exercise their voice. So when we started, looking at the numbers here, one thing that we also realized is that it's important to treat immigrants slightly differently from the newly naturalized. The newly naturalized, and this is what NPNA focuses on both through the naturalization work as well as with some of the civic engagement, you're going to have a different set of issues that folks may be thinking about or going through due to their current or most recent legal status. So Matt Barreto, who is a part of Latino Decisions and a professor out in California, in one of his books, he showed that recently naturalized citizens or naturalized citizens were much more likely to vote in response to basically anti-immigrant sentiment that happened in his case study was in California in the 90s. People reacted to that anti-immigrant sentiment and voted in large numbers because they knew, of course, that it was a personal attack. Now we know that it's an attack on all of us, but someone who is who has a family member who is naturalized or who themselves have gone through that process is going to be much more likely to react to some of the rhetoric from anti-immigrant forces and go out and vote. Whereas if in a different environment, people, the numbers show that folks are more likely to sort of stay at home. So one of the opportunities with 2020, and unfortunately with the rhetoric and with the policies of the Trump administration, is that people are likely, this is one of the opportunities, people are likely to vote in record numbers. And it's still on us and on campaigns and all of the civic folks involved in the civic engagement space to reach out to them and to mobilize them. But this is a ripe opportunity to turn out the new American voters and make sure that they're able to have a significant impact on the elections. I won't go over all the numbers. I know we'll be talking through some of that in the follow-up parts of this conversation. I will say that in seven states, the number of people who've naturalized in the last 5 years exceeds the 2016 margin for president of the United States, right? So just the newly naturalized in 7 states exceed the number of people who decided the election in 7 states. And of course, a lot of these are going to be naturally swing states where the margin may have been under 1% or 1 or 2%. So very, very powerful numbers. And I think that's the purpose of this campaign. I'll kick it back to Nancy and Diego to talk more about that. But the goal here is how do we really reach out to these communities, turn them out to vote, and make sure that they're getting the respect and the dignity that they deserve. Thank you.
Thank you, Abdel Nasser. And he'll be around if you have any questions about the report itself or any of the research. And we'll drop the report in the chat so you can also take a look at it. But it's over 100 pages of a reference guide that shows data across all 50 states. So you're able to look at data in Illinois, which of course is no surprise that's highlighted here on the map as one of the states with some top naturalization numbers. But I think you expect, California, Illinois, Florida to be on this list, New York, but look at Michigan's also on here, North Carolina and Pennsylvania. So there's states that are allies, are on a lot of these states, as well as Arizona and Texas, but Arizona and Texas a little more, some of the states that you'd kind of expect to have some of these high numbers of immigrants. So do check out the report. I think it's something that really helps with targeting. So we refer to this report as really the anchor of the campaign, where it's a data-driven strategy, because all of our targeting and everything is really based off of this data. So if you have any questions about that, we're happy to also address that. So next, I'd like to kick it over to my colleague, Diego, who's going to tell us a little bit about how we got here as far as the campaign. So I'll turn it, went ahead a little bit too much. All right, Diego, take it away.
Thanks, Nancy. So before we go a little bit more into the details of the New American Voters 2020 campaign, I'd like to give a little bit of a background of how we got to this moment. As Nancy mentioned, MPNA is a coalition of 40 plus immigrant and refugee rights organizations, and the majority of those organizations provide legal services. And they complement those legal services with grassroots organizing and advocacy campaigns. And the network includes what we call the MPNA Family Protection Network of 29 DOJ accredited organizations with over 150 attorneys and DOJ accredited representatives. And before the 2016 election, MPNA launched the Naturalize Now campaign to encourage the approximately 9 million immigrants who were eligible for citizenship to naturalize. And with MPNA member organizations, national partners, labor unions, congressional members, and mayor's offices, I'm glad to say that the campaign was largely successful in terms of its outreach to citizens, to folks who were eligible for citizenship and helping them through workshops, through Know Your Rights, through assistance with those applications, through communications and partnerships with ethnic media outlets to get folks the resources that they need to apply, and then go through that process. So just a few of the numbers. In 2014, fiscal year 2014, we had around 650,000 naturalizations. Around the time in 2015, when Trump announced his candidacy, that number shot up to 730,000 naturalizations. And then it kept increasing as that electoral season continued. So in 2016, we had around 753,000 naturalizations. And then we know what happened with the elections. And instead of, the numbers went down slightly, but they still remained incredibly high. So in 2017, we had around 707,000 naturalizations. 2018, they increased again, 761,000. 2019, 834,000. And the numbers have stayed high. We estimated in our report that this year we would see around 860,000 naturalizations. And unfortunately, that number is looking like it's going to be a lot smaller. So USCIS closed its offices during the height of the pandemic, which was one reason for the decrease. But then also USCIS refused to hold remote oath ceremonies, despite having the legal authority to do so. And according to its latest numbers, we're going to see around 600,000 naturalizations this year, despite a backlog of 700,000 citizenship backlogs before USCIS. And what we're seeing now is that around 300,000 applicants are waiting for their naturalization interview, and they won't be able to go to their interview, get naturalized in time to naturalize, and then be able to register to vote. So the mismanagement of USCIS and the backlogs is serving as a voter suppression tool that keeps people from voting. Nevertheless, as Naz mentioned, we have around 5 million naturalized citizens who have naturalized just in the last few years since 2014. And this shows that the successes of Naturalize Now, MPNA members, and other legal services providers have been sustained through 2016 and over the last several years. And it hasn't been easy at all. And that might be the understatement of the year. The administration has proposed and implemented a series of policies and practices that make citizenship more expensive, more complicated, and the process more lengthy. So I mentioned the backlog, which according to USCIS's latest data is over 700,000. Their processing delay a few years ago for a naturalization application was around 6 months, less than 6 months actually. Now it's around 9 months, but in many USCIS offices, we're seeing those delays exceed that. Some of them go beyond a year. Some of them go even beyond 2 years. At certain times during this current administration, we've seen certain offices reporting processing delays of 30 plus months. And this is despite congressional scrutiny. MPNA has filed a FOIA related to the backlogs. And when we didn't get a response, we filed a lawsuit against the agency. And complaints across the country from applicants, from legal services providers, from advocacy organizations, from congressional members. And USCIS has continued to operate in that way. The administration has also proposed to eliminate fee waivers, to limit the use of fee waivers by immigrants, but it's been stopped. It's currently prevented from doing so under a preliminary injunction. They've tried to make the application process more complicated for applicants' abilities who are seeking certain waivers. They are currently proposing to increase the fee of naturalization from $640 to $1,170. And there are several MPNA member organizations who have filed lawsuit in California and in the District of Columbia to prevent that. And we see that as one of the worst attacks on citizenships from this current administration. It could be effective. It was planned to be effective on October 2nd, but we're hoping that a federal court places a preliminary injunction due to the substantive legal faults of the rule, and then the procedures, how the administration violated the Administrative Procedure Act in proposing and going through to implement that rule. But despite all of these attacks, one thing that should give us all pride and strength is that immigrant and refugee families have not been intimidated. They know what this administration is about. They know of the multiple attacks to citizenship, to asylum, to DACA holders, to TPS holders, to folks who lack immigration status. And they know that one form of legal protection is citizenship. It protects them legally speaking, but it also provides them other opportunities, economic, the ability to travel, and then just security for themselves and for their families. And through the Family Protection Network that MPNA has, these are these member organizations with legal services. Some have huge legal departments of dozens of attorneys. Some are just one or two people who do tireless work in rural communities across the country. And they've been successful in helping to get these figures up, 5 million since 2014. So earlier this year, as the election approached, we decided that in addition to continuing this naturalization work, in addition to continuing the work to resist all the different regulations and rules and memorandums that was coming from the current administration to make citizenship more difficult, we should also recognize the fruits of the MPNA Family Protection Network's labor. That you had huge amounts of newly naturalized citizens, but now that they have naturalized, we need to make sure that they're registered to vote. We need to make sure that they're civically engaged and that their voices are heard, including in places where they have huge numbers and political representation, your New Yorks, your Californias, your Illinois, but then folks in Florida and Texas and growing electorates and growing communities across the country where you might not expect to see those numbers. So we decided to launch the campaign with two objectives, and that's to encourage the millions of newly naturalized citizens to vote. So as Naz mentioned in previous years, they voted less than US-born citizens, and the campaign seeks to close that gap through a series of tactics that we'll discuss later. And then we also want to build the national narrative around the growing electorate. That we're not talking about just a few naturalized citizens. We're talking about a political electorate that's growing and that should be recognized and respected, and their issues should be identified by political parties. So Naz mentioned the huge amounts of newly naturalized citizens compared to the margin of victory. So for example, in Michigan, the number of newly naturalized citizens from Iraq alone exceed the 2016 margin of victory. In Florida, the number of newly naturalized citizens from Cuba alone in recent years exceed the margin of victory. And the smaller groups, which are still huge, of Haitian Americans, of Jamaican Americans, of Venezuelan Americans, they also group together exceed the margin of victory. So they could, if they vote, they could sway the outcome of national, presidential, Senate elections, but then gubernatorial, state legislature elections. So that's what we're trying to do with this campaign, to have direct contact through MPNA member organizations, through ethnic media, through social media, all kinds of digital ways to reach out to the diverse potential electorate of new American voters, but then also build up the narrative that this is a huge potential, a political sleeping giant. So that's what we're doing with this campaign. We've been at it for a few months, and to talk a little bit more about the campaign itself and ways that folks could plug into it, I'll pass it back to Nancy.
Yeah, thanks, Diego. Thank you for that overview, and appreciate your and Naz's expertise in this area. So I think that we did want to provide a lot of this context because we all knew that this was going to be a really big year. I think we were not anticipating all of the wrenches that got thrown in the mix. So this is why New American Voters 2020 has pivoted to be a digital campaign. And I know that, we're having a digital conversation. Many of us are adapting to this new normal. But the big question is, our voters, our new American voters, are folks that have different obstacles such as language or never having voted before. It's embarrassing, if you just show up somewhere and you don't know how to do it, and maybe like your embarrassment impedes you from actually trying it. So there's so many obstacles that new Americans face. So as you heard in our introductions, all of us come from immigrant households. So this is something that's super personal to us, and I think is present and constant in all of the content that we're creating as part of this campaign. So really wanted to bring in the perspective of our parents, right? So if this doesn't make sense for my parents, I don't think it'll make sense kind of for the folks that we're trying to reach. And also, naturalized citizens are not a monolith. They're not just Latino, they're not just Asian, right? They're from so many countries across the world. But the common thread really being that of sacrifice, right? What did I do to be a US citizen? I was born. Like that's all I had to do, right? But we know that with a lot of the stories that we're collecting, a lot of the stories that we're lifting up, you hear about people that have lived in refugee camps for 2 decades. You hear about people that, crossed a desert and almost died or lost a loved one on the way. So I think that there's so many of these great stories of great sacrifice to be here and to have gotten to this step. So what we're telling folks is, you've made it this far, you've naturalized. So let's take it to the very last step and let's get you to vote. And some studies have shown that when naturalized citizens vote one time, they're, I think, just under 80% likely to be lifelong voters. So one of the things that we're also trying to communicate through this campaign, places like the YMCA New American Welcoming Center that, even on off election years, they're doing a lot of work with the New American constituency, mainly helping them get their citizenship. And I think that citizenship and investing in organizations that do this work is a really worthy investment, because these are potential voters that are really faithful voters once we get them to the polls even one time. So really this campaign is really trying to capitalize on the huge growth that we've seen, which Abdel Nasser named, the moment where we're seeing the countless attacks, which both of my colleagues mentioned, from this administration and different levels of government, and really trying to see if we can make the perfect storm to make sure that these folks get out to vote. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the tactics, some of the ways that we're getting folks to vote. And let's see if this, okay, there we go. So here on the left, you'll see we've grouped some of the strategies that we're implementing as far as ways to reach the communities and really trying to get where they are. What are they listening to? Who are they listening to? And then in what languages, things like that. So one of the things that we've been able to do successfully, and Diego alluded to this before, is that we have a media partnership with a broadcast company called Entrevisión. And so if you've seen like the Telemundo or the Univision news, the evening news in Spanish, this is that company, right? It is specifically tied to Noticias Univision. So we have a partnership with them through the end of October, and they're running a series of PSAs, and we've created an animated character. His name is Don Ramon, Mr. Ramon, and he has a backstory, of course. So he's a mechanic, and he, last year, when we were promoting folks to become citizens, his message was, I've worked really hard for my auto shop, and I really want to make sure that I don't lose it. So I'm going to do everything possible to be as stable as I can in this country. That's why I became a citizen, right? So that was kind of his thing, drawing on that, on the sacrifice element and on the hard work and how, I've worked for everything I have, which is often the stories of many of us, right? That are immigrants or come from immigrant households. And then this year, we've brought him back and he's saying, okay, if you just naturalized like me, we need you to vote. Even if this is your first time, there's a ton of resources out there. And so in all of these different ethnic media, we're doing TV, we're doing radio, we're doing podcasts, and we're also going to some YouTubers. So recently we were with a couple of young men who were Iranian YouTubers, and they have a huge following, among that, among the Iranian community in California, and actually nationally. So we had some of our organizers going on those shows and really looking at where are folks that we're trying to engage, what are they listening to, specifically when thinking about ethnic media, and doing stuff in that language. So for all of these, we're directing people. You can see on the right, this colorful map. If you go to newamericanvoters2020.org, this is right there on the homepage. So all of these different radio spots have the call to action and just say, register to vote, and request your ballot online, whatever you need. You go on this map, you click on your state, and it gives you in a drop-down format all of that information that you need. Secondly, on social media, what we're doing here is creating a bunch of videos. They're all subtitled and they have different angles. So for example, next week, I'll give you a sneak peek. We have a video coming out with a Venezuelan influencer who is former journalist and very well known across platforms. And she's a huge following on Twitter and Instagram. She's on the younger side, and just in February of this year, she naturalized. And actually, something that was really surprising to me was that when you look at the data of the newly naturalized, about a third of those are millennial or Gen Z. So about a third are actually relatively young. And I think that when I think of people that naturalize, I think of older people. So that was really refreshing and really interesting to see. And I think that there's a huge opportunity. And social media is a way to reach that younger demographic. Although we know that a lot of people are on social media, but millennials are more likely to be on things like Instagram or Twitter versus Facebook. So really tailoring the content that we're putting out, depending on who we're trying to reach, right? So the videos are coming out pretty consistently every 2 to 3 weeks. We have graphics that really break down some of the data from the report. I think that it's really exciting to hear that 1 in 10 US voters are immigrant, right? That's really exciting. And I feel like that's a lot of that data can really be used to empower the electorate. So that's the purpose behind some of those graphics. And paid ads, this is mostly being done right now through our partnership with Univision. We know that they have huge followings, so we're putting a little bit of money into some of those ads where they already have a huge following, so boosting those get us a lot more exposure. And that we're not really boosting by a ton, to be honest. I mean, maybe like $50 or less. And then it kind of goes a long way. But of course, it depends on your overall metrics and what you're trying to reach. And then I mentioned influencers. So we'll be working with Julissa Arce, a national best-selling author, an influencer. We'll be working with her on a project next week. We're working with the Venezuelan journalist. We worked with a Cuban American a poet, Richard Blanco, who was actually the poet laureate for Obama, the inaugural poet for Barack Obama, his first term. So working with folks that are connected to the issue and can kind of have that moral authority of, hey, I'm an immigrant and I think you should vote too. And then of course, traditional media, and with traditional media, really, really focused on hearing from those that are directly affected, hearing the testimonies of people that, for example, yesterday we joined here with Voces de la Frontera in Milwaukee, and part of the speaker lineup of the press conference was a couple who had been married for 50 years, came to the United States together, got their citizenship, applied for citizenship on the same day, had their appointment the same day, naturalized together that day, and will be voting for the first time together this year. So that's just like really beautiful story of love. It's really a story about love and perseverance in a new country. So that's something that got picked up by CNN, and really lifting up the stories of who folks are. We're doing individual profiles. We launched this around July 4th, and we're calling it the New Faces of America, and lifting up folks that have obtained their citizenship through NPNA member organizations. So these are co-branded, and we have their logo and our logo, and telling the story of how this, telling a little bit about this person's journey to naturalize. And then our members are really doing a lot of the work, most of our members are doing work on GOTV, Get Out the Vote. And what we're seeing that folks are pivoting to this year, maybe if folks had like a really big budget or a really big plan to do door knocking, to do canvassing, to do all of those traditional get out the vote tactics, we see that a lot of that is not possible in most of the country, right? Because of the pandemic. So a lot of folks are switching gears, and they're doing a lot of their outreach through what's called an RVP, or relational voter program. So this is basically, I'm somebody that wants to be involved with this organization. I'm going to make a list of my 20 people that I know that can vote, and I'm going to call them, and I'm going to keep track of this list. And then of these 20, I'm going to ask all of them not only to vote, but if they can make their own list of 20 people, that voters that they identify within their networks. So then this kind of web grows pretty widely pretty soon. And this is something that you don't have to be in person to do a lot of this work, and you can get pretty impactful numbers. So that's a tactic that many of our members are applying. And then also there's a lot of folks that are still going to the VAN, the Voter Access Network, and through data on here, reaching likely or unlikely voters, right? And we know that there's a way to find out who's an unlikely voter and who is a very likely voter. And then also, as Diego mentioned, most of our organizations, I would say when we started the legal services program, only 5 of our member organizations were legal service providers. And remember, they all started as advocacy organizations, but out of a need, you're working with a vulnerable community, they have a lot of needs, legal services being one of them. 5 organizations were giving legal services now. 31 of our organizations are legal service providers. And of course, that ranges, as Diego mentioned. But we have all of these amazing lists of people that our organizations have helped process, from lawful permanent residency to naturalization. So these are folks that maybe the LPRs already got their citizenship, right? Maybe they didn't come through us, but these are lists that people can call to make sure that these folks that now do have citizenship, that they're able to get out to the polls. So those are some of the ways that folks are activating folks within their organizational networks to make sure that they get out to vote. And with all of this, we're directing people to go to the map here. We know that all election information is super localized. So that's certainly one of the challenges with being a national organization. So our demands or our calls to action are pretty broad. And we always direct people back to this map, which you can find at newamericanvoters2020.org, as well as all of our reports, and including the one that Abdel Nasser was mentioning. So that's a little bit about some of the ways that we're reaching the New American electorate. And I'll actually stop there, and I'll turn it back over to Griselda. I'm not sure who's going to guide us through the Q&A.
I can do that. Thank you, Nancy, Diego, and Abdel Nasser. This is really valuable information. I learned a lot about the New American electorate, and so just thank you for your time. And now we'll open up for Q&A. So I would love to encourage our attendees to use the Q&A feature and ask your questions for the next about 10 minutes. And while we're waiting for people to type in their questions, I guess I can start us off. While you were talking, I was thinking about how my parents are naturalized immigrants from Egypt, and something that comes up a lot is their skepticism about voting itself. We've seen a lot of elections um, that are unfair and that don't seem honest, especially where they come from. And so there's kind of this sentiment of like, what's the point of voting? We've seen this in our home country and we don't trust it. So I'm wondering if that is a sentiment that comes up when you're talking to folks about voting in this country and how you go about talking about that.
Yeah, I can kick it off, and then if my colleagues want to join in as well. Um, we have a campaign, a project of NPNA is called We Are All America, and they focus on, they're the organizing field for the refugee organizations. So this is something that they come across a lot. And I think that with a lot of people that have been displaced from their homes, that have, come here with a really big distrust for government, that's certainly a question that comes up often. And I think that something that I've had to grapple with is, being able, I think that's valid. I think that first of all, we have to understand that those feelings and those experiences are valid. And I think that you can accomplish a lot more by talking to someone with love and with trying to get to an understanding. But I think that also explaining the system, I think that this country was founded, the way that this country was founded was meant to exclude most of us, right? So I think that also acknowledging that we've had to fight every step of the way for all of us to be able to vote. And we know that even so, we still have problems. But I think that just framing it in a way that, validating their thoughts, I think is really important. And I think secondly, explaining the system. And I think that a lot of people were really upset in 2016 when they said, well, this candidate won the popular vote, but then how did we then have this other candidate? So a lot of people, that didn't make sense. So then there was a lot of the sentiment, and I think not particularly to immigrant voters, but people thought, well, what's the point, right? If even you can win the popular vote. And so I think there it's explaining the electoral college process and how this works and all of that. And yeah, I think it's not fair, but I think that instead of sitting there and feeling super hopeless, I think that voting is a way, but it's not the only way we're going to achieve change. So I think those conversations are important. And I think that approaching them from a caring and loving way, not like a defensive way, will get you farther. So I don't know if any of my colleagues want to add anything or in their experience.
Sure. Yeah, no, that feeling absolutely exists, across many different communities in the immigrant community where there may not necessarily be a culture of democracy or voting, or where the elections are, 99% for that candidate. And so, it's a tough thing to change, perspectives and attitudes on elections and voting. And I think one of the most important things is to have that personal conversation, like Nancy's saying, that personal relationship. I would point to some of the exciting developments since 2016 with elections of a refugee like Ilhan Omar, right? People like Rashida and others who really, I think maybe they can relate to their family's experiences. Them one being a refugee or children of Palestinian immigrants, and being able to say, look, we were able to elect. And obviously throughout the Latino community and the Asian community, of many examples of, here in Chicago, Chuy Garcia, a naturalized, immigrant who's elected to Congress, saying it's possible for us to achieve these things. And these are, but we need to obviously exercise our right to vote. I would also point to I've found it useful to point to the civil rights movement and say people died for the right to vote, right? This is something that was hard fought, and especially this is for young people, for anyone who who questions the wisdom of voting, is people really fought so hard and died for this, and it's important that we not take it for granted, especially what we see with the authoritarianism in our current administration. If we want to make this country our home and improve it, we got to try it. This is one thing that's important for us to do.
Yeah, and I would just add to this conversation, this is somewhere where the need for trusted communicators is absolutely essential. So of course, there's so many different materials and campaigns related to get out the vote. And MPNA wanted to launch this campaign, not in a way that would be duplicative of those, but would kind of within our lane and our identity and our specialties, further that work. So for example, MPNA has a network in the Family Protection Network of community navigators who are mostly women, DOJ accredited representatives and organizers who do know your rights and who come from the communities that they serve. They're able to talk to their community members in a much more relatable and direct way than a commercial can be, right? So utilizing that network of people who have been doing this work, who have been helping people adjust to their new life in this country, and deal with that skepticism and also just the pessimism of what is my vote going to count for anyway. So doing this campaign to do that education around the civic engagement process, how to register to vote, how to do the absentee ballot, walking people through that. But then also related to that skepticism that you mentioned, Michelle, meeting people where they're at and then seeing where so many people have been politicized during these last few years, and they've been concerned and they just naturalize and they have that energy to utilize that towards building up this growing electorate.
I want to add one more thing. I think the research by Matt Barreto showed that this is the type of environment where immigrants are under attack. I mean, so many communities are under attack. I think we're more likely to sort of get people's ear when we talk about how important it is to vote and to get involved, because things are not normal. And I think people, the feeling and having your entire community come under attack by government and by this administration, I think that'll be something that will at least make it more likely that those conversations will be fruitful. I think if folks are living their lives not real, if they weren't as impacted in the past, it may have been harder to convince them. I think this is a different moment.
Thank you all for your answers. That was super helpful. So yeah, we're gonna keep rolling along. If you have questions, please drop them in the chat. If there are other things you as panelists wanted to mention that you didn't get a chance to, please feel free to do that too.
Yeah, I want to put in a little plug for an event that we're having next week that actually kind of dovetails nicely from the conversation that we're having. So we're gathering elected officials who are naturalized next week, Tuesday. So it's called, it's a digital rally / press conference. We'll also be inviting members of the press. And it's called Our Voice, Our Vote. Our Stories, Our Vote. The Rising New American Electorate. And so we have folks like the chair of the New Americans Caucus, California Representative Norma Torres. She's leading the event. She's originally from Guatemala, naturalized. Chuy Garcia, who Abdelnaser mentioned, I know is a friend. He'll be joining as well. And I know that we've been reading lately about Lena Hidalgo from Texas, the 29-year-old Harris County judge. She'll also be joining our lineup, and she's has a really impressive story as well. And a lot of people have compared her to AOC and just kind of riding the wave of these young, fearless women of color that I think I draw a lot of inspiration to. From when we're looking at all of these horrible things that are happening, we also see that it really paves the way or creates the opportunities for this intense response, right? And I think that that's certainly something to be hopeful for. And among others, Representative Judy Chu from California as well, Representative Grace Meng from New York. So all of these folks are either naturalized themselves or first generation and have immigrant parents. So really kind of talking from that perspective and how our stories have shaped us. So some of the topics that you brought up, we'll be talking about. But really the big call to action here is now that you've naturalized, we need you to vote. So you're hearing this from your congresswoman or your county judge, and really hoping that we're able to get to folks through this event. So I'll send you the details if you'll want to share it, or maybe I'll drop it here in the chat. But just wanted to let folks know that that's happening on Tuesday.